Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers of the 2022 PGLDS annual conference for inviting me to speak today on tips on writing a good clinical manuscript. Here's an outline of what we're going to talk about in the next 15 to 20 minutes or so. I will share with you the attributes of a good scientific paper, the components of a good scientific paper, things to do before you start writing and even before you start the study itself, some general guidelines about manuscript writing, and then followed by some specific points. Once you submit, what can you expect after that and how to respond to that and how to address that. And I must emphasize that the focus today is going to be on clinical papers and not basic science papers, which may have a slightly different format and requirements. Let's start off with the attributes of a good scientific clinical paper. I think the first and foremost attribute of a good paper is that it answers a novel question. And this question is clinically relevant or as public health relevance and is important for the context where you practice. A good scientific paper is rigorously designed and executed, and there is a hierarchy in terms of the importance of various study designs which the journals decide. And generally, randomized controlled trials receive the highest priority in most journals. But regardless of which design we choose and which is more appropriate for your kind of study, a good sound design, appropriate selection of the study population, and the correct analysis plan are critical to the success of a paper. A good scientific paper is well written in clear and simple language. There are no spelling, grammar, or syntax mistakes. And I would urge you to double check, triple check, and even share with others to critique that before you submit the paper for publication. A good scientific paper follows a logical sequence. It tells a good story in an appropriate sequence of events. All sections follow a clear and logical progression. And it should not be jumping from one topic to another haphazardly without connecting the dots. Good scientific paper also adheres to ethical and regulatory guidelines. You should have all IRB approvals, regulatory approvals, patient consents where they are required in place before you even do start the study. And for randomized clinical trials or any intervention trials, they should be listed in international clinical trials databases even before you enroll the very first patient or subject. So just to iterate, before you even start the study, you have to have a clinical trial registration if it is a clinical trial at a site, for example, like clinicaltrials.gov, but there are other international sites which are acceptable as well. Depending on the type of study that you're doing, you should follow the appropriate reporting guidelines, and consort guidelines are one of the more broader or general guidelines, but you could have more specific guidelines based on the type of study or type of study design, for example, stroke guidelines. And as I mentioned, get all the regulatory approvals right up front. Before you submit a paper to a journal, you need to decide where to submit it. And I would urge you to choose the journal wisely based on multiple factors that may be of importance to you. The relevance of the journal to the topic that you are writing on is important. You should also look at how rapidly the journal completes peer review and publishes after peer review has been completed. You should look at the review process itself, that the journal is truly peer reviewed. You should look at the audience of the journal. For example, if you're writing hepatology paper, there's no point submitting this to an allergy journal or a kidney diseases journal unless there is a specific material related to that specialty. You should look at the impact of the journal, where the journal is indexed, and whether or not it is open access and belongs to, for example, a professional scientific society or not. Every journal has different requirements for submission, so I urge you to read the instructions for authors very, very carefully and adhere to them. Follow the font requirements, the margin sizes, line spacing guidelines, and so forth. And assemble all the materials before you start uploading the files. That will save you a lot of time and effort going back and forth if you've assembled all materials before you even start the submission process. In certain cases, you may be able to write to the editor or a deputy editor before submission. And this is to gauge their interest in the topic that you're studying. And if the paper is among priority areas for the journal, generally they will ask you to submit either an abstract or some information so that they can make that determination. We talked about the reporting guidelines, and here is a framework for randomized clinical trials, the consort guidelines. And you can get these on Google, or most of the journal websites, submission portals also have this for different types of studies. For example, for cohort studies, for case control studies, for meta-analysis, and so forth. Each one of them has a framework of reporting guidelines which you should adhere to. And many journals will even ask you, how have you adhered to these guidelines specifically? Before you start the submission, again, you should gather the full names, email addresses, institution affiliation of all authors. Have that ready so that when the journal submission portal asks you to enter them, you're ready to immediately enter them. Most journals will also ask you for potential peer reviewers. You should gather names and contact information of perhaps up to 3 or 4 peer reviewers and can provide that to the journal. A cover letter is required in most journals, and this letter should have some generic components and some things very specific to your paper. Generic component would be your introduction that we are delighted to submit this paper to your journal, etc., etc. And then some specific things about your paper, the title of your paper, and why is the topic that you are studying and writing about, why is that important? You can provide a little bit of context. This letter does not have to be long. It should be no more than 1 page, perhaps even less than that. But give them a little bit of information, key or salient points about the paper, why you did that, why is it important, and how can this change practice. Tables and figures are critical components of a good scientific paper. They generally can be uploaded within the body of the main article at the end of the text. However, some journals require them to be uploaded separately as individual files. So you should look at that, look at the requirements for that particular journal you're submitting to and adhere to that. So let's go into the specifics of a scientific paper. And again, we're talking about a clinical paper. So the first and foremost thing is a title page, which contains information about the authors, their affiliations, their word counts, contact information for the corresponding author, some disclaimers, conflict of interest statements, and so on and so forth. Following the title page or pages, generally you have the abstract page, and we will talk about that in a second. Then you get into the main body of the article, and generally most articles follow the same headings or same progression. You start with introduction, followed by methods, then you share the actual results of your study, and follow that by a discussion of your findings. At the end, you can put all the references that you've quoted in your paper, and if you have any supplementary data which was not appropriate for the main paper, or additional analysis which you want the readers and the reviewers and the editors to look at, you can put that in the supplementary data sheet. This will not be published in the main body of the text, but will be made available online by the journal for the readers. Let's start with each one of those items and go over them quickly. Let's start with the title page, which is the first part. Generally, a title should be a catchy phrase that reflects a major message from your study. It should not give the results of your study, but some indication of what you are talking about. And I'll give you a couple of examples out here from recent papers that we have published. For example, waning of VNT162b2 vaccine protection against SARS-CoV infection. It tells you what we're talking about, what the paper is going to be about, and what the setting would be. It doesn't give the results of that, but enough for a reader to determine if he or she is interested in reading this paper. Some journals have character limits, so you should again adhere to that. The title page, the details of the title page are listed below, on the right-hand side for one of the papers that we published recently. It should have author information, keywords, word count, number of tables, figures, etc. Who funded the study, if there was funding available, disclosures and conflict of interest statements, and acknowledgements. And there should also be an authorship statement that who had access to data and who decided about publication. In other words, did funders or any other organizations or people had any say whether you were going to publish this paper wherever you wanted to or not. Moving on to abstract, there are two types of abstracts that journals follow: structured or non-structured. And I'll give you examples of that in the next slide. The word count is very important in abstract, and it is a hard stop for the journals. In other words, they will not allow you to go over the word limit even by one word. The abstract should contain your most important results and message. It does not have to contain all the results. Actually, should not contain all the results unless they're a very small body of results. But the most important message that you want to give across should be in your abstract. Because remember, most of your readers will read only the abstract and not the full paper. So make sure that message that you want to be conveyed to everyone is in there. There should be enough information on methods and study population, but again, you do not need a tremendous amount of details in the abstract. Here are two examples of completely unstructured abstract, which is a requirement by one of your specialty journals, hepatology. It does not follow any headings or format. On the right-hand side is a paper we recently published in Adams Internal Medicine, which requires a very highly structured abstract with multiple headings and subheadings. And again, the example is out there. You need to understand and know what the journal requirements are and follow that. However, most journals fall in between the two, meaning they don't have 8 or 10 headings and they're not completely unstructured, but they have 4 basic headings. And this is the most common type of abstract format. So the 4 headings here are background, methods, results, and conclusion. And again, adhering to the word count is very, very important. After the abstract, you start the main body of the paper itself. And generally, the first section is introduction. Here, you generally write about the background and significance in about 1 paragraph or so, and share your hypothesis or specific objectives. This is not supposed to be a detailed review of literature of the topic, but only to set up the stage for what you are going to present in this study. If there are any controversies or if there are any gaps in knowledge, that is where that is what you share out here. And like I said, it is basically to set the stage for why you did the study and why is it important. The next part is the methods part, and generally I divide that into 8 sections. Not all sections may be appropriate for the type of study that you do, but if you remember these 8 subheadings, you won't miss any important part of the methods. I generally start the design and followed by the setting. Design meaning whether it was a prospective study or a retrospective study, where was the study conducted, goes into the settings part. Then you talk about participants. Who did you include in the study? Who did you exclude? Followed by data sources. How did you collect the data? Where was the data collected from and by who? If there were any interventions, you mentioned those interventions and how you carried those out. Followed by what were the outcomes that you were going to study that were of importance to you. Then you give some information about the statistical methods that you use, and almost all studies have missing data or attrition in the study, and how did you address this becomes a part of the method section as well. Having explained how you did the study, you go into the results section, which is what you found. And here again, there are 5 main headings that I use, again, so that I don't miss anything out. I start with the baseline characteristics of the study population. I share the descriptive data initially, followed by what the outcomes of interest were. And then I follow that by more detailed and nuanced analysis about modeling, if I've done any, for example, regression models or factors associated with the results and so forth. Both adjusted and unadjusted models, as appropriate, should go out here in this section. The final part of the results is if I did any additional analysis, like subgroup analysis for specific subpopulations, and any sensitivity analysis to demonstrate that my results, my main results, were valid and appropriate. Generally, I'm not too heavy on the numbers within the text of the results. I give the main results here, and if I have much more detailed and nuanced results that need to be shared, I refer to the appropriate table or figures. This brings me to the next part, which are tables and figures themselves. So again, generally we follow a logical sequence in both tables and figures. Starting with the tables, the first table is generally baseline characteristics of the study population. If you are comparing two or more study populations, this table should also have a comparison of the baseline characteristics of those groups. Table 2 is generally the main comparison of any subpopulation, or if in table 1 we have not been able to provide the comparison of the two groups of population, study populations of controls, this is where you can do that. From table 3 onwards, depending on the extent of results, you can have as many tables as you want to within the limit set by the journal. Table 3 onwards is your primary outcome, then your results and the modeling that you did. Similarly, figures also follow a normal and logical progression. The first figure should be about how you constructed the study population. It's a study flow sheet or cohort construction or study subject construction. And figure 2 onwards are comparisons and your main outcome results. For example, Kaplan-Meier curves, bar charts, histograms, scatter plots, whatever is appropriate for your study is what goes out here. This is followed by the discussion section. So once you have presented the results, you need to be able to discuss the importance of your results and how they fall in the context of what is already known or not known in literature. Once again, it follows a logical sequence or progression. I start with the first paragraph being a very, very short summary of the main results. I do not put any more than 2 or 3 lines out here. I summarize the key point or the key result from the study. Paragraph 2, I start explaining the results that I've shared in the results section. I provide context in terms of what is known, what has been published before, how do I interpret my result in that context and by itself, and compare them with what is previously known, and then also try to share what could be the reason or mechanism of the results that I found. What are the possible explanations of those results? So depending on how many results or how many main items you want to discuss, there could be 2, 3, or 4 paragraphs out here. Then the penultimate or the second last paragraph is generally about the limitations of the study and generalizability. You can also put the strengths of the paper out here before the limitations part, so that reviewers and editors and the readers, of course, understand the full context of the strengths and limitations of the study and whether they are applicable to larger populations or not. Then the last paragraph is again a brief paragraph about conclusions and where do we go from here, as maybe a sentence about future directions. In other words, the discussion section is about what you found, what is the explanation for that finding, what did you miss, or what could you have done better, and why is that finding very important. So what happens after you have submitted the paper? So there are 1 of 4 possible outcomes. The journal can reject the paper outright without any further review, and this is quite a common outcome. The journal can also accept without further review, but this is extremely rare. I've had this maybe twice out of the last 100 papers I submitted. Very often they would ask for some editorial clarifications. You may have missed something that is required, some piece of information that is important for the journal to have before they make any further determination, and they'll ask you and then you can respond to that. And finally, the 4th outcome is that they can send it out for peer review. And this is the outcome we generally hope for, that once it goes out for peer review, we hope that the strength of the paper will carry it through peer review and will be asked to revise. After the first decision, if it is rejected, what can you do? If the paper is rejected without review, you can submit to another journal with or without any changes to that paper based on if any new information has come to light. If the journal has sent it for peer review and you've received comments from peer reviewers, you can submit to another journal with or without addressing the comments from those reviewers. Some of the reviewers' comments can actually be very, very helpful and make your paper much stronger. And if you're able to address them, I encourage you to do that before submitting to another journal. If they ask you to revise and resubmit, which is a very desirable outcome, make sure that you answer every single point, every single comment, and critique that both the editors as well as the reviewers have sent to you. Be very respectful and deferential to reviewers. Don't argue with them, even if you disagree with them. It has to be very, very polite. And if you decide to not address a comment, in other words, not do what they've asked you to, you should clearly write down what the reason for your disagreement is. Again, in a very polite manner, in a very respectful manner, starting with, we really appreciate your comment. However, we would like to point out that A, B, C, D, E, F, this is why we disagree with you, and we cannot or would not do that. One thing I encourage people is that if you get a rejection, that is not the end of the story. Do not be discouraged by rejections. Most high impact journals accept less than 5% of the submitted papers. You must ensure that the language, spelling, grammar are flawless. Reviewers get very upset at these mistakes, and they consider these as evidence of lack of attention to detail and sloppiness of your work. In some cases, you may need to submit to 6 to 8 journals, sometimes even more, before a positive response. To give you an example, our last papers required 83 submissions, ranging from 1 to 13 submissions per paper. One paper was very difficult to get into because the interest in the topic waned very quickly, and we had to submit to 13 journals to get it published. But some of them got submitted or accepted to the first journal that we submitted to, but of course, after peer review and resubmission. So strategizing after your paper has been written. So there are 6 steps that I talk about. You choose the journal and choose the journal carefully. You format the paper according to the journal requirements that you're going to submit to. Assemble all required materials before you start the submission process. Once you've uploaded that, hit the submit button. If you get asked to respond to peer review critiques, respond to the critique and repeat items 1 through 5 as often as needed. So in summary, a good clinical paper requires a lot of work, thoughtfulness, and collaboration. You should choose novel questions for your study. You should choose rigorous methodology with appropriate statistical methods, appropriate study population, and so forth. Pay great attention to details like spelling, grammar, and language. Ensure that all ethical and regulatory requirements have been adhered to, and be persistent, because persistence pays off. It is very common for the first and second, perhaps in third, fourth, and fifth journals to reject your paper, but be persistent and keep submitting till you get a positive outcome. I will stop here and hand it back to the organizers and the session chair for any questions. Thank you once again.